I still remember the exact weight of that duffel bag. 42 pounds. I know because I weighed it on the scale in the hallway of St. Agnes' home the morning I left, the same battered scale the staff used to weigh donated clothing. 42 pounds was everything I owned in the world. 2 pairs of jeans, a handful of shirts, one sweater with a hole near the left elbow that I had been meaning to fix for 2 years, a paperback novel with a broken spine, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a clean sock so it would not get scratched, a small framed photograph of 2 people I barely remembered, my parents. That Tuesday morning in March was my 19th birthday, the day the state of Oregon decided I was no longer its problem. They call it aging out. It sounds almost gentle, like something that happens to cheese or wine. In reality, it means that the system which has fed you and housed you and made every decision about your life for as long as you can remember, looks you in the eye, hands you a manila envelope, and wishes you luck. The envelope contained a list of shelters, a pamphlet about job training, a check for $100 that felt like both a fortune and an apology. I stood on the front steps of St. Agnes and breathed in the March air, cold and damp. A pigeon pecked at something in the gutter. A city bus hissed at the corner. The world moved around me the way it always had, completely indifferent to the fact that I had just been set loose in it with 42 pounds and no map. I had lived at St. Agnes for 6 years. Before that, 4 different foster homes. Before that, a life I could only access in fragments. A smell of wood smoke. A voice, low and warm. Hands that were rough and careful at the same time. I had spent years trying to hold on to those fragments and years more, trying to let them go. And I had never quite managed to do either. The director, Mrs. Farwell, caught me at the bottom of the steps. She was a thin woman with silver hair and reading glasses that never seemed to be in the right place. She had never been unkind to me. She had also never once asked me how I was sleeping. She existed somewhere in the careful middle distance that professionals learn to maintain, close enough to manage, far enough not to feel. She held out a thick envelope. Her expression was the same as always, professional, measured, slightly sorry. "This came for you yesterday," she said, "from a law firm. I thought it might be important." I took it. The paper was heavy in my hands, expensive. My name was typed on the front in clean black letters. Clara Mercer. I did not open it there. I walked to the bus stop, sat down on the cold metal bench, and stared at it for a long time. Law firms meant trouble, debt, someone suing someone. I could not imagine what a law firm could possibly want with a girl who had spent her whole life owning nothing. Finally, I tore it open. The letter was on thick cream paper with the heading Patton and Associates, Attorneys at Law, with an address in Helena, Montana. It said that my grandfather, Elias Mercer, had passed away 7 months prior at the age of 82. It said I was his sole heir. It said he had left me his entire estate, a farmhouse and outbuildings in Millhaven, Montana, approximately 600 acres of land. I read it 3 times. The words would not settle into meaning. 600 acres. I had spent my entire life in rooms that were 10 feet by 12, shared bedrooms with strangers, dormitories with thin walls and thinner privacy. The largest space I had ever occupied alone was a bathroom the size of a closet. 600 acres was a number so large it had no shape I could hold in my mind. My grandfather was dead. The man I had spent 14 years resenting, the man I had convinced myself had simply decided I was not worth the trouble, was gone. And he had left me something. I took a bus across the city to the address on the letterhead. The offices of Patton and Associates were the kind of place I had only ever seen in movies. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs that sighed when you sat in them, bookshelves lined with volumes that looked like they had never been opened, a silence so complete you could hear the second hand on the grandfather clock in the corner. Mr. Patton himself was around 70, kind eyes behind thick glasses, a three-piece suit that probably cost more than everything in my duffel bag combined. He did not look at my worn jeans with judgment. He looked at me like a person, which was more than most people managed that day, and he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit down, Miss Mercer. We have a great deal to discuss." He walked me through the inheritance methodically. The land, the farmhouse, the barn and outbuildings. A small trust fund, enough to cover property taxes for 5 years and provide a modest living stipend. Not a fortune, he said, but enough to give me time. Then he slid a second envelope across the desk, smaller, older. The paper was soft with age, the edges worn to a gentle fray. My name was written on the front in handwriting I did not recognize. Shaky and deliberate, the letters formed slowly, like someone who was concentrating very hard on each one. "He left this for you as well," Mr. Patton said. "He stipulated that I was to give it to you only when you turned 19, not before." He paused. For a moment, the professional composure shifted, just slightly, like a curtain moving in a draft. "I knew your grandfather, Miss Mercer. Not well, but enough. He was a private man, kept to himself. But he talked about you more than he talked about anything else." He looked at me carefully over the rim of his glasses. "He said once that the hardest thing he ever did was let you go. And the second hardest was waiting for you to come back." My throat tightened. I stared at the envelope in my hands. I could not open it. Not there. Not in that office with the ticking clock and the careful eyes of a man who had known my grandfather and I had not. Whatever was inside that envelope had waited 14 years. It could wait a little longer. But there was one question I could not leave without asking. "He hired someone," I said, "to watch me for 14 years. Why?" Mr. Patton looked at me for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, "is what the letter is for." The bus north took 11 hours. I watched the city dissolve through the window. Suburbs giving way to farmland. Farmland opening into something wilder. Trees multiplying, thickening, pressing close to the road. Mountains appearing on the horizon, their peaks still white with March snow. I had never been to Montana. I had never been anywhere, really. The farthest I had ever traveled was a school field trip to a natural history museum when I was 12. Now I sat with my duffel bag wedged between my feet and my grandfather's unopened letter on my knee and watched a world I had never imagined unfold outside the glass. Forests of pine and aspen, a river catching the afternoon light, a hawk tracing wide circles in the sky, and above it all, so much sky. In the city, you see sky in strips, between buildings, above roads. Here it went on, horizon to horizon, blue and enormous, and quietly overwhelming. I held the letter the entire way. Several times I started to open it. Each time I stopped. I was afraid of what it might say. An explanation, an apology. Or worse, more questions, more pieces of a story I still did not understand. The letter had waited 14 years, but I was not ready for it to end. The bus pulled into Millhaven just as the sun was beginning to set. Millhaven was barely a town at all. A crossroads with a gas station, a general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign. A diner with a neon light in the window. A white church with a steeple catching the last gold of the day. The air when I stepped off was like nothing I had ever breathed. Cold and sharp and clean in a way that almost hurt. Pine and wet earth and something wild underneath. Something older than any smell I had a word for. A dusty pickup truck was waiting in the small gravel lot. A painted sign on the door read Pruitt's Taxi. The woman leaning against the hood was somewhere in her late 50s, weathered face, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical braid, eyes that crinkled when she saw me. She knew who I was before I said a word. "You must be Elias's granddaughter," she said, pushing off the hood and extending a hand. Her grip was strong and calloused, the hand of someone who had spent decades doing real work in the real world. "I'm Lorraine Pruitt. Been driving folks around these parts for 30 years. She studied my face with an expression I could not quite read. Assessment, curiosity, something softer underneath. "Your grandfather called me once, about 2 years back. Said his granddaughter might be coming someday. Asked me to watch for you." She looked at me for a moment longer. "You've got your mama's eyes," she said quietly. "Same way of standing, too. Like you're ready to run, but deciding whether to stay." My heart stopped. "You knew my mother?" Lorraine nodded slowly. "Sarah Mercer grew up in this town. Prettiest girl in the county, people used to say. Smart as a whip. She left for the city when she was 18. A pause, a cloudiness moving through her expression. "She came back once with your daddy and you. You were just a tiny thing, maybe 2 years old." She shook her head gently, the way people do when they are pushing away a memory that weighs too much. "Come on, let me take you home." The drive to the farm took 25 minutes on roads that grew rougher with every mile. Pavement to gravel to a rutted dirt track winding through stands of pine and aspen. The trees pressed close overhead, their branches forming a canopy that turned the fading light green and golden. Lorraine talked as she drove, filling the silence with small, careful pieces of my grandfather. How he came to town every other Saturday for supplies. How he helped rebuild the Henderson family's fence after a bad winter without being asked and left before anyone could thank him. How he left vegetables on porches during harvest season without ever leaving a name. He kept to himself mostly, she said. But when someone needed something, Elias was always there. Quiet about it. Never wanted thanks. Just did what needed doing and went back to his place. She glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "He talked about you, though. Not often, but sometimes. Said he had a granddaughter out east. Said he hoped she was doing all right." A pause. "Said he wished things had been different." I looked out the window and said nothing. My throat was too tight for words. And then the trees parted and I saw it for the first time. The land opened before me like something out of a painting I had not known I was waiting to see. Rolling hills covered in tall grass, still pale from winter, catching the last light and turning it silver. Wildflowers pushing up through the meadow in stubborn early patches of purple and yellow. A creek threading through the lower fields. And beyond it all, mountains. Real mountains. Snow-capped and enormous. Painted rose and amber by the dying sun. At the center of it sat the house, 2 stories. A wrap-around porch. Gray paint that had begun to peel at the corners in a way that made it look not neglected but lived in. The way old things look when they have been used and loved for a very long time. Solid, enduring. A house that had stood through storms and would stand through more. Behind it, dominating the landscape the way a cathedral dominates a small town, was the barn. Massive, Red paint faded to a dusty rust. The roof with a slight sag in the middle that somehow made it look not broken, but patient. Even in the fading light, there was something about it that demanded attention. Something that felt like a held breath. Lorraine handed me a ring of iron keys, old and heavy and cold. The big one was for the front door, the others for the outbuildings. "Listen," she said, her hand resting briefly on my arm. "I know this is a lot, a whole lot, all at once. But if you need anything, you come find me. I'm at the gas station most mornings, or the diner most evenings." She looked at me steadily. "This town looks after its own, and you're one of ours now, whether you know it yet or not." I thanked her, paid her with the travel money Mr. Patton had given me, watched the red taillights disappear between the trees, and then there was only silence. Not the hollow silence of an empty room in a group home, not the silence of being the last one awake in a dormitory full of sleeping strangers. This was a living silence, full of wind moving through grass, an owl calling somewhere in the tree line, the creek murmuring to itself in the dark. The world was not empty here. It was crowded with things that breathed and moved, and had been here long before me. I stood in the yard for a long time, breathing it in. The front door groaned when I pushed it open. Stale air washed over me, carrying dust and old wood and something faintly spicy, like pipe tobacco and cedar. I found the light switch. The electricity was still on. The lights came up dim and yellow, illuminating a world preserved exactly as it had been left. A worn armchair beside the stone fireplace, a knitted blanket draped over one arm, a book lying open and face down on the side table, as if someone had simply stepped out to make tea and forgotten to come back. Bookshelves overflowing with volumes on every subject, farming manuals and history and poetry and books about birds and trees and the stars. He had been a reader, a thinker, not the broken, incapable man I had spent years imagining. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching things. The smooth wood of the banister, the cold iron of the kitchen stove, a pair of work gloves on the counter, the leather stiff with use, the ticking of a small clock on the mantel. Everything quietly waiting. In the kitchen, the refrigerator held fresh milk, butter, a covered dish of something that smelled like it had been made that morning. Flowers in a jar on the windowsill, not wilted. The kitchen floor had been swept recently. The dish towels were clean and folded. Someone had been here recently. Someone was taking care of this place. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms. In the first, clearly his, a narrow bed with a handmade quilt in faded blue and white, a dresser with a cloudy mirror, a nightstand with a framed photograph I picked up with shaking hands, a young couple, laughing, squinting against bright sunlight, my mother's nose crinkling the way it did in the one photograph I had carried all my life, my father's hand on her shoulder, easy and proud, and behind them, younger, straighter, with dark hair and that same quiet intensity I had carried as a vague childhood memory, my grandfather. I held the photograph for a long time. Then I noticed the wooden box on the dresser, half hidden behind a stack of books. I opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and they were all of me. Me at 5 years old in a foster home backyard, wearing a dress too big for my frame. Me at 8, walking to school with a backpack that dwarfed me. Me at 11, sitting alone on a playground swing while other children played behind me. Me at 14. Me at 16. Me at 18. Ordinary days. Ordinary streets. Captured by someone standing far enough away that I had never known they were there. 14 years of watching. My hands began to shake. He had not forgotten me. He had not moved on. He had been watching every single year from a distance I had never once suspected. And he had said nothing, never written, never called, never once appeared at a door to tell me he was there. Why? Why watch from the shadows when he could have come forward? Why leave me in that system when he could have fought to bring me home? The questions were still burning in my mind when I heard the knock at the front door. A gentle knock, 3 times, soft. The kind of knock that is already prepared to be told it is not welcome. I went downstairs and opened the door. She was a woman in her early 70s, with white hair cut close and a face full of the kind of lines that come from decades of weather and feeling things deeply. She wore a plain coat and rubber-soled shoes. In her hands, she held a covered pot, still steaming. Her eyes found mine, and something moved through her face. A complicated thing. Warmth and grief and something else. Something that looked, for just a moment, like relief. "I'm Bet Holloway," she said. "I live just through the tree line on the north side. I've been keeping an eye on the place." She held out the pot a little. "I made stew. I thought you might not have had time to get to the store." I looked at her. She was smiling, but her eyes were doing something different from her mouth. She started to say something, and then stopped. Swallowed. Tried again. "I knew your grandfather for 20 years, she said carefully. "He was a good man, a very good man." I thanked her and took the pot. I asked if she would like to come in. She said not tonight, maybe another time, and she said it in the way people say things when they are carrying something they are not yet ready to put down. She turned to go, then stopped, turned back. "I knew your mother too," she said. "Sarah." Her voice was barely above a whisper. She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "I'm glad you're here, Clara. I'm very glad you came." She walked back through the dark toward the tree line. I stood in the doorway watching until she disappeared. There was something in the way Bet Holloway had looked at me. Not the way a neighbor looks at a stranger. Not even the way a kind person looks at someone who has had a hard life. It was something else. Something weighted. Something that had been sitting in her for a long time, waiting for the right moment that kept not arriving. I closed the door. I set the stew on the counter. And in the quiet of my grandfather's kitchen, with the clock ticking on the mantel and the photographs upstairs and the unopened letter still in my coat pocket, I heard a sound from the back of the house, a soft sound, nails on old floorboard. I turned. A dog stood in the kitchen doorway, old, with a graying muzzle and amber eyes that caught the dim light. He stood very still and looked at me the way animals sometimes look at people, with a steadiness that makes you feel examined and understood at the same time. Then he crossed the kitchen, slowly, without hurry, and pressed his head against my hand. His name, I would learn later, was Scout. He had been my grandfather's dog for 11 years, and from the moment I arrived, he never slept anywhere except outside whatever room I was in. That first night, I sat at the kitchen table with the pot of stew and the box of photographs and the unopened letter and the questions that had no answers yet. I sat there for a long time, listening to the house settle around me. The tick of the clock, the wind against the windows, the soft breathing of the dog at my feet. 600 acres, a house full of someone else's life and someone else's secrets. A woman who had known my mother and could not finish a sentence about her. A grandfather who had watched me from a distance for 14 years and never explained why. Two questions waited in the dark. Why had someone been caring for this house before I arrived? And why, the night my parents died, had Elias Mercer decided that the safest thing he could do for his granddaughter was to make himself disappear? The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Not because I wanted to. I had not slept well in years. Thin walls and shared rooms and the close attention of someone who learned early that the world does not always stay safe while you are unconscious. But this was different. This was a house that made sounds. The wood contracting in the cold. The wind finding gaps in the old window frames. Scout shifting his weight in the hallway outside my door. I lay in the narrow bed in the second bedroom. Not my grandfather's room. I was not ready for that. And listened to the farm wake up around me. Birds first before the light. Then the creak of the house itself, as if it were stretching. Then the slow gray brightening at the curtain edges. I got up and made coffee on the old gas stove. Found a bag of ground coffee in the cabinet above the sink, the same brand I imagined he had bought every week for 50 years. The coffee came out strong and slightly bitter. I stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and watched the mist rise off the meadow in long pale ribbons. Scout sat beside me and watched it too. On the counter, still untouched, was my grandfather's letter. I was not ready for it yet. I told myself I needed one normal morning first. One morning of just standing in a kitchen and drinking coffee like a person who belonged somewhere. I had not had that in a long time, maybe ever. By mid-morning, I had made a list of what needed doing. The list was long enough to be discouraging and short enough to feel manageable if I did not look at it all at once. The irrigation system in the east field had a section of broken pipe. The porch railing on the north side was soft with rot and needed replacing before it gave way entirely. The root cellar door was swollen shut. The chicken coop needed attention. The barn, which I had not entered yet, which I kept finding reasons to approach and then not approach, waited at the edge of my awareness like a question I was saving. I started with the irrigation pipe. I did not know what I was doing. That was the honest truth of it. I had grown up in the city. The closest I had come to farming was a container of basil on a windowsill at St. Agnes that Mrs. Farwell kept insisting was not dying. I crouched in the mud of the east field with a wrench I had found in a kitchen drawer and stared at a section of pipe I did not understand and felt the fury of not knowing something that should be learnable. Bet appeared at the edge of the field around 10 o'clock. She was dressed practically. A canvas jacket and rubber boots, and she was carrying what appeared to be a casserole dish covered with aluminum foil. She stopped a few feet away and looked at me in the mud with my wrench. "That section needs a coupling joint," she said, not unkind, just factual. "There's a box of them in the barn, left side of the workbench. Your grandfather always kept spares." I looked at her, then at the pipe, then back at her. "I can show you," she said. "Whole system, start to finish. Shouldn't take more than an hour to explain, and then you'll have it." She said it the way she said most things, quietly, without pressure, like she was offering something she was prepared to have turned down, and something in me wanted to turn it down. Old habit. The stubbornness of someone who has been refused helps so many times that accepting it feels like a debt you cannot afford. I had learned early that accepting things from people meant owing them something, and owing people things meant they had a kind of power over you, and power in the wrong hands was the most dangerous thing in the world. "I'll figure it out," I said. Bet nodded once and said nothing more about it. She set the casserole dish on the porch railing with a small thud and walked back toward the tree line. I watched her go. Then I spent the next 3 hours in the mud figuring it out. I got it eventually. I am stubborn in that way that crosses over into something almost useful. But I thought about Bet the whole time, about how she had offered and how I had refused, and how she had not made me feel guilty about it, which somehow made me feel more guilty than if she had. That afternoon, I drove Elias's old truck into Millhaven. The truck was a green Ford from sometime in the early 90s, with a manual transmission I had to relearn from memory and a heater that worked intermittently. It smelled like sawdust and old coffee and something faintly floral that I could not identify. I drove with both windows down despite the cold, because the smell of the truck was too much like the fragments, the low voice, the warm hands, the thing I could never quite hold on to. Millhaven's main street was 4 blocks long, a hardware store, a general store run by a couple named the Aldermans, a diner with a hand-lettered specials board in the window, a post office the size of a large closet, a bank, a real estate office with a rental listing in the window that had clearly been there for several years. I went to the hardware store first, for the coupling joints Bet had mentioned. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his early 30s, lean with the kind of quiet, physical competence that comes from years of actual work rather than a gym. He had dark eyes and an unhurried manner, the ease of someone who is comfortable with silence. He looked up when I came in, and something shifted in his expression, brief and contained. "You must be Elias's granddaughter," he said. I was getting used to being recognized before I spoke. "Clara," I said. "Calhoun Reed." He did not extend his hand, but his tone was direct, the kind of direct that is different from cold. He reached under the counter without asking and set a box of coupling joints on the surface. "Figured you'd be coming in for those. Eastfield pipe's been leaking since November." I told him I'd fix it, but he said he'd get to it. There was a weight to those last words that he did not elaborate on. "Your grandfather," he said after a moment. "He built half the barns in this county, including mine." He looked at me steadily. "People around here don't forget that." Then a woman appeared from the back aisle, and the temperature of the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She was in her late 50s, impeccably dressed for a hardware store, wearing a blazer the color of a storm cloud and a smile that had been practiced into smoothness over many years. Her hair was the silver of someone who had chosen to look distinguished rather than old. She carried herself with the ease of a woman who had been the most influential person in every room she walked into for so long that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. "Well," she said, the smile reaching her eyes just enough to be technically warm, "you must be Clara. We've been hoping you'd come into town." She extended her hand. "Sylvia Wakefield. I chair the Millhaven Community Council. We like to welcome new residents personally." I shook her hand. Her grip was brief and precise. "Such a brave thing," she continued, her voice perfectly calibrated between admiration and concern, "taking on a property like that alone. At your age, with no farming background." She tilted her head slightly. "Of course, the sensible thing would be to consider all your options. A property that size requires real resources to maintain properly, real expertise." She was not saying anything overtly unkind. That was the craft of it. "I'm figuring it out," I said. The same words I had said to Bet, but with a different feeling behind them. Sylvia's smile did not waver. "Of course you are. Well, if you ever want to talk through those options, my door is always open." She set a business card on the counter beside the coupling joints. "Welcome to Millhaven, Clara." She left. Calhoun watched her go, then looked at his counter. Said nothing. I picked up the business card, looked at it once, and set it back down. On my way out of town, I stopped at the general store for groceries. The woman at the register, Darla Alderman, was in her 60s with kind eyes and a tendency to narrate whatever she was doing. She told me the prices on eggs had gone up, told me the good peaches would not come in until July, told me Elias had been in just 2 days before he got sick for the last time. Bought his usual, she said, coffee and dried beans and one of those crossword books. He did one every day, right to the end. I nodded and paid and carried my bags to the truck. Drove home with the windows down, despite the cold. That evening, with the coupling joints installed and the irrigation system running, and the satisfaction of having solved something I had not known how to solve, I found myself walking toward the barn. It was almost dark. The sky was the deep blue that comes just before black, and the first stars were appearing over the mountains. The barn was a dark shape against that sky, enormous and patient. I had been circling it since I arrived, the way you circle something that you know will change you once you enter it. The lock was stiff with disuse. The chain fell away with a sound that echoed across the empty field. I put my shoulder against the door and pushed. The interior opened up into a cathedral of shadows. The ceiling soared into a maze of rafters where barn swallows had built their nests. Light from my flashlight cut through the dusty air in bars. Motes drifted in the beam like small, slow planets. The smell was old hay and dry wood, and the metallic trace of tools long unused. On one side, empty animal stalls, their gates hanging open. On the other, a workbench that stretched the length of the wall, its surface scarred with decades of use. Tools hung above it on wooden pegs, each in its place. Saws and hammers and chisels and planes, everything clean and oiled. Someone had cared about these things the way you care about things that have served you well for a long time. I ran my hand along the workbench surface. The wood was smooth under my fingers, except where it was scarred. Decades of work recorded in the grain. This was where he had spent his days. This was what he had been. In the back of the barn, half behind a stack of old hay bales, Scout stopped walking and sat down. He just sat there and looked at a particular section of the floor. I moved the hay bales. Beneath them, against the wall, half hidden in shadow, was a wooden crate, newer than everything else in the barn. The wood still relatively fresh, the nails still bright, and burned into the lid, cleanly and deliberately, a single letter, M. My family name, Mercer. My heart rate changed. I found a crowbar at the workbench and came back. The nails shrieked coming out. Splinters flew. The lid came away in a shower of dust, and I looked inside. Files. Dozens of manila folders arranged in neat rows, some thick, some thin. And on top, 2 things. A heavy leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, and a small metal box with a combination lock. I lifted the journal out first, opened it to the first page. The handwriting was dense and slightly uneven. The entry was dated almost 20 years ago. They came to me today, a young woman and her child. She said she had nowhere else to go, that he would find them if they stayed in the city. I told her she could stay. The root cellar is hidden well enough. I have supplies to last months if needed. I don't know who is chasing her. I don't need to know. What I need to know is that she is scared and she is running, and she has a child to protect. What is a life worth if you won't risk it for another? I turned the page. Another entry, weeks later. They left today. New names, new papers, new life. I gave them what I could. The woman cried when she left. The boy waved at me from the car window. I don't know if I'll ever know whether they made it, but they had a chance. That is all I could give them. I sat back on my heels with the journal heavy in my lap. My grandfather had not been a simple farmer. He had been running an underground network, quietly, alone, for decades. People fleeing violence, witnesses hiding from people who wanted them dead, anyone who needed to disappear. This barn, this land, this house that sat in the middle of nowhere on a dirt road no one had reason to drive down unless they knew exactly where they were going. All of it had been a refuge, a way station, a place where people could become someone new before moving on. I read for a long time. The light shifted. The barn grew dark around me. I did not notice. The entries documented 20 years of work, families, individuals, journalists who had published dangerous truths, whistleblowers whose testimony threatened powerful people. Each one arrived with nothing and left with a chance. He did it without recognition, without compensation, without telling a single person in Millhaven what was happening inside his barn at 2 a.m. And then I turned to an entry dated 14 years ago. The handwriting was different here, pressed harder into the paper, less steady. They killed them, Sarah and Michael. Made it look like an accident. Car off the road on a rainy night. No witnesses. But I know. I have seen the evidence. Crestwood Development killed them because they were getting too close. Because they had proof of what that company was doing to communities, to water supplies, to people who couldn't fight back. And now they will come for Clara, my granddaughter, 5 years old. 5 years old and already a target. I stopped breathing. I cannot take her. If I bring her here, they will find her. They will find us both. The only way to keep her safe is to let her disappear into the system, to let her become anonymous, one of thousands of foster children, invisible, untraceable. It is the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than any of the others because she is my blood. The last piece of Sarah I have left. But I will watch over her. I will make sure she is safe, even if she never knows, even if she hates me for the rest of her life. The journal fell from my hands. My parents had not died in an accident. I sat in the dark of the barn for a long time. Scout lay close beside me. I did not move. The cold settled into my bones, and I did not notice that either. I sat with what I had just read the way you sit with something, after it knocks the wind out of you, waiting for the body to remember how to breathe. I thought about what 14 years of anger feels like when you find out it was protecting you all along. It does not go away, that anger. It does not simply dissolve into understanding, but it changes shape. It becomes something harder to hold and harder to put down, because now it is grief and anger together, and the two of them pressed against each other inside your chest in a way that has no name. I left the journal in the crate. I needed to think before I read more. I needed the open air. I walked back to the house with Scout at my heels and the mountain dark pressing in from every side, and I was almost at the porch steps when I noticed that the back window of the kitchen was not quite where I had left it. I always latch the kitchen window. It was the first thing I had done when I moved in. A habit from group homes, from rooms where your things were never entirely yours. I always latched it. It was open 2 inches. I went inside carefully, stood in the kitchen and looked. Everything appeared to be in place. The stove, the table, the box of photographs on the counter where I had left it. But something felt different in the way a room feels different when someone has passed through it recently. I checked the living room, the bedrooms. Nothing obviously disturbed. Then I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room where I had left the files I had pulled from the wooden crate the first night. The 4 files I had set aside to look through more carefully. 3 of them were still there, exactly where I had left them. The 4th was gone. I stood very still and looked at the empty space where it had been. Someone had been in this house. Someone who knew which file to take. Someone who knew the crate existed, who knew what was in it, and who was paying close enough attention to know I had started reading. I thought about Sylvia Wakefield in the hardware store, her smile, her business card, the way she had said, "Consider all your options," with the patience of someone who was already several moves ahead. I thought about Bet Holloway, who had known exactly which spare parts were in the barn, who had been maintaining this house for months, who had looked at me with something in her face I still could not name. I thought about the entry in my grandfather's journal, the entry about my parents, about Crestwood Development, about a company that had already proven it would remove obstacles when they became inconvenient. I thought about Calhoun Reed standing behind his counter, quiet and watchful, who had known my grandfather and had chosen his words carefully. 3 days on this land, and I already had more questions than I had arrived with. But now one of them was urgent. Someone knew I was reading. Someone knew what I was getting close to. And they had walked into my house in the middle of the day and taken something to slow me down or warn me off. And they had done it quietly enough that I had been in the barn 20 feet away and heard nothing. I latched the kitchen window. I sat down at the kitchen table with the 3 remaining files and opened the first one. I read until the small hours of the morning when the cold finally forced me to bed. And just before I turned off the lamp, just before I closed the last file and put it carefully back in its place, I found it at the back of the 3rd folder. A single page, handwritten, clearly removed from the journal at some point in the past, different from the journal entries, more agitated. The date was recent, 6 months before Elias died. Crestwood has been circling again. They want the land. They always want the land. But they don't know what's buried in it. And they don't know what Sarah and Michael found before they died. The proof is still here. All of it. Hidden where no one would think to look. I've been waiting for the right moment. I've been waiting for Clara. I set the page down very carefully on the table. I looked at Scout, who looked back at me with his old amber eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the meadow grass. Somewhere out there, the mountains stood in the dark, patient and permanent. And somewhere in the north section of the land, under the barn floor or the root cellar or somewhere I had not yet found, my parents' work was waiting. The same work that had gotten them killed. The same work my grandfather had spent 14 years protecting. The same work that someone had just broken into my house to prevent me from finding. I gave myself one more day before I confronted Bet. Not because I needed time to be certain. I was already certain. The fresh food in the refrigerator the night I arrived. The swept kitchen floor. The flowers in the jar. The way she had known exactly which spare parts were in the barn without having to think about it. The way she had looked at me in the doorway that first night, like someone who had been rehearsing a conversation for years and still could not find the opening line. She had been caring for this house. She had been the one walking through these rooms, keeping them ready. And she had been in this house recently enough to know which files I had pulled from the crate. I spent that day working. I fixed the porch railing. I cleaned the root cellar door until the swelling gave and it opened properly. I made a proper inventory of the food stores in the pantry. I did all of it methodically and without pause, because keeping my hands busy was the only way I knew to keep the thing building in my chest from getting ahead of me. In the late afternoon, Calhoun Reed's truck appeared at the end of the dirt road. He pulled up without announcement, got out, and looked at the barn roof with a professional squint. Then he looked at me. Said I'd fix that when Elias asked, he said. Still owe him. I watched him for a moment. You don't owe me anything. No, he agreed, but the roof still needs doing. He went to his truck bed and started unloading materials without waiting for my answer. I stood there for a moment and then, because arguing felt like wasted energy and the roof genuinely needed fixing, I went and held the ladder. We worked together for 2 hours without talking much. That was the thing about Calhoun. He did not fill silence the way most people do, as if quiet were a problem requiring a solution. He worked steadily and carefully, and when he did speak, it was to the point. "You find anything in the barn?" he asked at one point from up on the roof. I looked up at him. "Like what?" He kept working. Elias kept things. Important things. A pause. He told me once there was something buried out here that would matter someday. Didn't say what. Didn't say when. I thought about the journal, the files, the missing page, the metal box I still had not found the combination for. "I found some things," I said carefully. Calhoun came down the ladder as the light was fading. He wiped his hands on a cloth from his back pocket, looked at the barn roof, looked at me. He was a careful man, he said. Everything he did on purpose. He paused, looking out at the meadow. I lost my wife 2 years ago. After that, I thought Elias was the only person around here who understood what it meant to carry something you can't put down. He said it without self-pity, just a fact he was choosing to share. Then he got in his truck and drove away, and I stood in the yard watching his taillights until they were gone. The next morning, I walked through the tree line to Bet's house. It was a small place, white clapboard with green shutters, a kitchen garden along the south wall, a row of bare rose bushes waiting for spring. Smoke rose from the chimney. The smell of coffee reached me before I reached the door. I knocked. She opened it almost immediately, as if she had been expecting me, or as if she had been awake long enough already that she was just moving around inside waiting for the day to give her something to do. She looked at my face, and something in her own face shifted. A settling. Like someone who has been waiting for a difficult thing to finally arrive. "Come in," she said quietly. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and something baking. A tabby cat slept on a chair by the window. Framed photographs covered the walls, faces I did not recognize, a life I knew nothing about. On the table, there was already a second cup set out. She had known I was coming. I sat down. She sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked. The cat shifted in its sleep. "You were in my house," I said. "You took a file." Bet wrapped her hands around her cup. She did not deny it. She just looked at the table between us and breathed in and out once, slowly. "I panicked," she said. "When I saw you had started pulling things out, I panicked. I thought if you read it too fast, without understanding the whole picture, you'd—" She stopped. "I was trying to protect you. I know how that sounds." It sounds like something someone says when they've done something wrong and want it to sound like something else. She nodded. "You're right. It was wrong. I'll give it back." She stood and went to a drawer near the stove, came back and set the file on the table between us. It was intact, untouched. I left it there. "Tell me," I said, "all of it." Bet sat back down. She looked at her hands for a long moment, and then she began. She had known Sarah and Michael for 3 years before they died. Not close friends, she said, but neighbors in the real sense of the word, people whose lives brushed against yours in ways that mattered. She had watched Clara's parents work, had known they were investigating something serious, had known they were worried. Sarah had said once, only once, that they had found something that could not be unfound, and that they were being careful. The night of the accident, Bet had been awake late. She had seen headlights on the road. A car she did not recognize, idling outside the Mercer property for a long time. She had stood at her window and watched it, and felt the cold that is not about temperature. She had picked up the phone. Then her phone had rung first. It was Commissioner Wakefield, Sylvia's husband. His voice was pleasant and unhurried, and he said 3 sentences. He said he understood Bet had been having some trouble with her property tax assessment. He said he thought that could probably be resolved. He said that being a good neighbor sometimes meant knowing which things were worth getting involved in and which were not. He hung up. Bet set her phone down, and Sarah and Michael Mercer drove into a ravine on a wet road 40 minutes later. I have lived with that every single day for 14 years, Bet said. Her voice was steady, but only barely. Every single day. I told myself it might not have mattered, that they might have gotten there before I could have done anything, that one phone call might not have changed anything. She looked up at me, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew even while I was telling myself. The kitchen was very quiet. Elias knew, I said. Yes. He figured it out within a week. He came to my door one morning and stood there and looked at me, and I couldn't even deny it. She pressed her lips together. He didn't shout. I almost wished he had. He just looked at me and said, "You were afraid. I understand being afraid. But those were my people, Bet." And then he walked away. But he let you keep coming. He let you take care of the house. He didn't let me. I just kept coming. Because what else could I do? I couldn't undo it. I couldn't go back. All I could do was show up and try to be useful and hope that someday... Her voice broke. I lost my son 3 years ago. Cardiac arrest. He was 44 years old. She looked at the photographs on the wall. After that, I thought about giving up on a lot of things. But I kept coming to Elias's house because it was the only place I knew how to do penance that felt honest. She looked at me directly, and then he told me you were coming. He said his granddaughter would come when she turned 19, and I should be ready, and I should help you, and I should tell you everything. A pause. He said you were strong enough to hear it. He said that more than once, that you were stronger than any of us. I looked at her for a long time, the woman who had been warm to me from the first night, who had brought soup and a recipe in my mother's handwriting and offered to teach me the irrigation system I had stubbornly refused to learn, who had been carrying a specific crushing guilt for 14 years and had shown up anyway, over and over, because it was the only form of apology available to her. And something rose up in me that had nothing to do with understanding or compassion. "You watched them die," I said. My voice was very flat. "You had a chance to help, and you didn't take it because a man called you on the telephone and mentioned your property taxes. And then you spent 14 years making soup and sweeping floors and calling it penance." I pushed back from the table. "I don't want your penance, Bet. I don't know what I want from you, but it is not that." She said nothing. She just sat there and let me say it. "I need you to leave," I said, "please." She stood. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob. "The metal box," she said quietly. "The combination. It's the date your parents were married. June 14th, 1999. Then she walked out. I sat in her kitchen for a moment after she left, staring at the file on the table. The cat slept on. The clock ticked. I picked up the file and walked back through the tree line to the farm. Scout was waiting on the porch. He looked past me toward the direction I had come from. Then he looked at me. Then he got up and trotted purposefully in the direction of Bet's house. I watched him go. I called after him once. He did not come back. Inside, I found the metal box in the crate where I had left it. I sat at the kitchen table and turned the dial with hands that were not quite steady. June 14th, 1999. 6/14/99. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were two things. The first was a thick folder of documents. Corporate memos on Crestwood Development letterhead. Financial records showing payments made to county officials through a series of shell companies. Printed emails between Crestwood executives discussing what they called the Mercer situation. Environmental reports that had been falsified, with the original reports attached for comparison. Evidence of illegal dumping at 3 different sites across 2 states that had poisoned groundwater serving rural communities. And a single email, printed and highlighted in yellow by someone's careful hand, between Crestwood's chief operating officer and a man named G. Hale, reading, "The M problem has been addressed. Confirm no further exposure. G. Hale." Garrett Hale. The man who had shown up at my door in the suit that probably cost more than the truck in my driveway. The email was dated the day after my parents died. I set it down very carefully on the table. I smoothed it flat with my palm. I looked at it for a long time. The second thing in the box was smaller. A tin, round, with a lid that fit snugly. Tied around it was a ribbon that had once been blue and had faded over years to a color that was almost gray. Inside the tin were envelopes, 17 of them, each one sealed, each one with my name on the front in the same careful, deliberate handwriting as the envelope Mr. Patton had given me. One for every birthday. I opened the first one. The paper inside was thin and slightly yellowed at the edges. My dearest Clara, today is your 5th birthday. I cannot be there. I cannot hold you or give you presents or sing to you the way a grandfather should. But I want you to know that not a day goes by when I do not think of you. You are the first thing I think of every morning and the last thing I think of every night. I cannot keep you safe any other way. The people who took your parents would take you too if they knew where to find you. So, I let you go. I let the world think I was a broken old man who couldn't care for his own granddaughter. I let you be angry with me. You deserve to be angry. But I need you to know, wherever you are, that the anger and the silence and the distance were never because I didn't want you. They were because I wanted you alive more than I wanted you close. I love you, Clara. I always have. I always will. One day, I hope you'll understand. Your grandfather, Elias. I put the letter down. I did not cry. Not yet. I was past the place where crying was the first response. I was in the place that comes after, the dry, still place where something is rearranging itself inside you, and the body does not quite know what to do while it waits for the rearranging to finish. I sat at the kitchen table with 17 letters and a folder full of evidence in the fading afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, and I thought about what 14 years of silence can mean. How it can be the opposite of what it looks like. How absence can be the most active form of love available, the kind that requires more from you than presence ever would. I thought about Bet. I was still angry. The anger had not gone anywhere. But I was beginning to understand that Bet's silence had come from the same place as my grandfather's. Fear. The paralysis of someone who has measured the cost of speaking against the cost of staying quiet and made the wrong calculation in the space of a single terrifying moment. She had been wrong. She knew she had been wrong. She had spent 14 years knowing it. I was not ready to say that made it all right, but I was beginning to understand that it made her human. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I pulled open the bottom drawer of Elias's desk, the one that had been stuck since I arrived, the one I had been putting off. It came free suddenly with a crack of old wood. Inside was a single envelope, unsealed. The name on the front was in my grandfather's hand, Sylvia Wakefield. Inside were 3 pages. Bank statements showing wire transfers from a Crestwood shell company to an account registered to Gerald Wakefield, Commissioner. A letter from Gerald to Elias dated 8 years ago, warning him to stop asking questions about the Mercer accident. And a handwritten note from Elias, never sent. She knows, she has always known. I wonder sometimes if she is waiting for someone to give her a reason to say so. I read it twice. So Sylvia had been carrying this too. Not the guilt of action, like her husband. The guilt of knowing and staying quiet. 14 years of building a life on top of a silence she had never chosen to end. I set the envelope on the table beside the folder of documents. 2 kinds of silence, 2 people waiting in different ways for the same thing to be over. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Not a letter, a notice, printed on county letterhead, slid under the front door sometime in the night. My property tax assessment had been reassessed, effective immediately. The new figure was 4 times the previous rate. Failure to pay within 90 days would initiate foreclosure proceedings. 2 days after that, a certified letter from the State Department of Environmental Quality. An anonymous complaint had been filed regarding contaminated runoff from my property. An investigation was being opened. Potential fines, if violations were found, could reach into the hundreds of thousands. 2 days after that, a letter from a law firm I had never heard of. Certain portions of the northern acreage, the letter claimed, had never been properly surveyed. Boundary disputes of this nature could take years to resolve. In the meantime, the affected sections of land might be subject to a temporary use restriction. I spread the 3 letters on the kitchen table and looked at them. This was what it looked like when powerful people decided to remove an inconvenience, not one big blow. 3 small ones, arriving in sequence, each one designed to drain a different resource. Time, money, will. The goal was not to win a single confrontation. The goal was to make the cost of staying higher than the cost of leaving. I called Mr. Patton. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "They're trying to bury you in paper," he said. "It's a classic strategy. They have armies of lawyers, bottomless pockets. They'll keep filing until you can't afford to fight anymore." A pause. "Unless you fight back." "With what?" I said. "I don't have money for lawyers. I barely have money for groceries." "Then you find another way." His voice was steady. "Your grandfather was fighting this battle for years. He didn't have money either. He had something better." Another pause. "He had the truth, and he had people who knew the truth. You need to find those people, Clara. I believe they are already closer than you think." I was still sitting at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand when the truck appeared at the end of the dirt road. Not Calhoun's truck, different. A sleek, dark sedan that had no business on a dirt road in March. It stopped in front of the house with the deliberateness of a vehicle driven by someone who has arrived to make a point. Garrett Hale got out. Same suit, same practiced smile, same unhurried walk toward the porch, as if the mud of the driveway were simply not capable of touching him. "Miss Mercer?" He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me with an expression of practiced warmth. I heard you've had some complicated news lately. I wanted to check in personally. I looked at him from the top of the steps. The email is dated the day after my parents died, I said. I know what it says, and I know what you are. Something moved through his expression. It was very brief and very cold, and then it was gone, replaced by the smile again, wider now and worse. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, he said pleasantly. But I do want you to know that our offer stands. In light of recent complications, we'd actually be prepared to increase it considerably, as a gesture of good faith. He looked out at the land, at the mountains behind it, with the proprietary gaze of someone measuring dimensions. You're alone out here, Miss Mercer. You're 19 years old, with no resources and no allies, and a mountain of legal trouble that is only going to grow. That is a very difficult position. He let the silence sit for a moment. We just want to help you find a way out of it. The wind came down from the mountains and moved through the meadow grass, and I stood at the top of my grandfather's porch steps and looked at the man who had sent an email about my parents the day after they went into that ravine. Get off my land, I said. He did not move immediately. He looked at me for a moment with that cold thing behind his eyes, calculating and patient, the look of someone who was used to waiting for people to tire out. Then he turned and walked back to his car. The offer won't stay open forever, he said, without turning around. He drove away. I stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded. Scout came from the edge of the yard, climbed the steps, and leaned against my leg. I put my hand on his back and held it there. That night, a storm came down from the mountains. Not a gentle spring rain. A real storm. The kind Montana does in March when it wants to remind you that warmth is still a promise and not a guarantee. Wind that found every gap in the old window frames. Rain coming sideways against the glass. The power flickered once and held. I was reading by lamplight when I heard it. A sound from outside that was wrong in the way sounds are wrong at 2 a.m. in a storm. Not the wind, not the rain. Something else. I went to the window. The knob of orange light at the edge of the barn was small at first. Almost nothing. The kind of thing you could convince yourself was a trick of the storm. A reflection. A mistake. Then it was not small. I ran. The barn doors were already open when I reached them. The chain gone. The padlock missing. The fire had started at the far wall near the old workbench, climbing the dry wood with the speed of something that had been encouraged. The tools were already lost. The beautiful, careful tools he had hung on their pegs and oiled and cared for over 50 years. Gone. I got inside far enough to reach the crate. Scout was beside me, low to the ground. I grabbed the metal box and the journal and pulled them out with me into the rain, and the fire was behind me, and the heat was enormous, and the rain hit my face like small cold hands. I stood in the mud and watched the barn burn. The volunteer fire department came. They saved the corners. They saved the root cellar beneath the floor. They saved the section where the old tractor sat, unmoved for decades, and the packed earth around it. They did not save the workbench. They did not save the tools. They did not save the hay bales or the old crates or the 30 years of small history that a man accumulates in the space where he does his work. The fire chief was a steady man named Henderson with a weathered face and a careful manner. Could be the wiring, he said, walking the perimeter of the damage in the gray morning light. Old structures like this, the insulation goes. He never ran electricity to the barn, I said. Henderson looked at me. He always used battery lanterns, I said. There was no wiring to fail. Henderson looked at the barn for a long moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook and told me he would be in touch. An hour after he left, my phone rang. I did not recognize the number. I answered anyway. "Miss Mercer." Garrett Hale's voice was smooth and warm and deeply satisfied. "I just heard about the fire. What a terrible thing. These old properties, the hazards just accumulate over time." A pause. "I hope you weren't hurt. I really do. A young woman out there alone. All these things going wrong at once." Another pause. "Our offer is still on the table. In fact, I'd like to increase it once more. Given everything you've been through." I held the phone and looked at what remained of my grandfather's barn. The metal box was on the kitchen table. The journal was beside it. The 17 letters were in their tin. The folder of evidence was intact. All of it pulled out of the fire in the dark with my grandfather's dog beside me. He had built the barn. He had built the workbench and hung the tools and oiled them every year and used them to build things for the people of this county for decades. And now the barn was half ash and the tools were gone. And Garrett Hale was on the phone, waiting for me to break. "I know what you did," I said. "To my parents. I have the email. I have all of it." My voice was very steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. "And I am not selling you 1 acre of this land. Not today. Not ever." I ended the call. I set the phone on the table, and then I sat down in my grandfather's kitchen with the evidence he had spent 20 years gathering and the letters he had spent 17 years writing, and I started to think about who I needed to call in the morning. Not a lawyer, not Mr. Patton. A journalist. I found Aldred Marsh the way my grandfather had found most things worth finding, through someone who knew someone who had reason to be careful about who they told. Mr. Patton gave me the name. He said Marsh had spent 6 years investigating corporate land fraud in rural counties and had a reputation for 2 things: getting the story right and not backing down when powerful people asked him to. He said Elias had known about Marsh for years, had been watching his work, had been waiting for the right moment. I called Marsh at 7 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I had documentation connecting Crestwood Development to 2 deaths ruled accidental 14 years ago, to systematic bribery of county officials across 3 states, to environmental crimes affecting rural water supplies, and to a coordinated campaign of harassment and arson against a private landowner. I told him I had original documents, printed emails, financial records, and a 20-year journal kept by the man who had been gathering it all. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Where are you?" he said. He drove to Millhaven the same day. We met at the kitchen table. Marsh was 34, lean and somewhat rumpled, with the alertness of someone whose mind is always slightly ahead of the room. He spread the documents across the table methodically and read without speaking. He read the way serious people read things that matter, slowly and completely, going back to check one document against another. He read the highlighted email last. He held it for a long time. "Your parents gathered most of this," he said finally. Not a question. "They were close to going public when they died," I said. He looked at me across the table. "How long have you had this?" "The documents, a few days. The journal, longer." "And the fire?" "3 nights ago." He wrote something in his notebook, looked at the email again. "This is enough to open a federal investigation. With verification, it is enough to end the company entirely." He set the paper down carefully. "Your parents would have known that. That is why they are dead." He said it plainly, without softening it, and I was grateful for that. I had spent days surrounded by careful people who chose their words to protect me from the sharpest edges. Marsh just said what was true. "I need 2 weeks to verify everything," he said. Cross-reference the documents with public records, talk to former employees, confirm the financial trails. He looked at me steadily. There will be pushback. Once they know someone is asking questions, they will accelerate whatever they are planning here. They already burned my barn, I said. Then they will try something else. He closed his notebook. Can you hold for 2 weeks? I thought about the tax notices, the environmental complaint, the boundary dispute, the three-pronged assault designed to exhaust me. I can hold, I said. The day after Marsh left for Helena, I drove north on the old logging road to find Winona Redhawk. I had read about her in the journal. Elias had written about her more than almost anyone else, with a respect that was quieter and more careful, the way you write about someone whose understanding of the world runs deeper than your own. She had been his closest ally in the work he had been doing to document the sacred land in the northern section of the property, the burial grounds, the ceremonial sites, the places that Crestwood surveys had noted as empty land and passed over with the efficiency of people who are paid not to find certain things. Her cabin sat in a clearing 6 miles north, at the end of a track that was barely a track at all, a stone chimney, wind chimes made of bone and glass singing in the cold air, a garden put to bed for winter under a layer of straw, an old dog lifting its head as I pulled up, but not barking. Winona herself came out onto the porch before I had turned off the engine. She was 74 and carried herself with the uprightness of someone who has never found it necessary to make themselves smaller to fit other people's comfort. Silver hair down her back, dark eyes that took in everything at once. You are Elias's blood, she said. Not a question. Clara Mercer. She studied me for a moment with the quality of someone who sees past the surface of things to whatever is moving underneath. He said you would come, she said. He said to tell you the land remembers, even when the records have been lost. And the records have not all been lost. She held the door open. Come in. Her kitchen was warm and smelled of cedar and something herbal. We sat at her table and I told her everything. She listened completely, without interruption. When I finished, she looked out the window at the forest for a long moment. For 150 years, she said quietly, people have been telling us that our history is folklore, that the names we carry and the places we protect are superstition. She turned back to me. Your grandfather understood that was a lie. He spent the last 10 years of his life gathering the evidence to prove it. Archaeological surveys, oral histories recorded and transcribed, geological studies, all of it. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her grip was dry and strong. It is in the root cellar, the section beneath the tractor. He told me where everything was. He told me you would come, and I should tell you. I looked at her. He planned all of this, I said. He planned all of this, she agreed, from the day he decided to keep you safe by letting you go. He knew the company would come back eventually. He knew the land would be at risk. He knew he was getting old. She paused. He knew you would be 19 when you arrived. Old enough, free enough, strong enough. She said the last words the way Bet had said them, as if Elias had said them so many times that the people who had known him had simply absorbed them. He was waiting for you, Clara. Everything he built here, everything he saved and documented and protected, he built it for you to finish. I drove back to the farm in the late afternoon with the mountains turning gold in the west and the weight of what I was carrying sitting differently in my chest than it had that morning. Not lighter, more defined. The difference between A burden you do not understand, and a burden you have chosen. The zoning hearing was scheduled for Thursday. Crestwood's final application for development permits. The hearing that would give them the legal right to break ground and begin the work of turning 600 acres of grassland and sacred ground into luxury cabins and a golf course. Commissioner Wakefield, Sylvia's husband, was on the panel. The outcome had almost certainly been decided before the hearing was announced. On Monday, Marsh called. The documents were verified, the financial trails confirmed. 3 former Crestwood employees had agreed to speak on background. 2 of them had been present during conversations about what the company had called the Montana situation. One of them, a man who had left the company 7 years ago and had been living quietly in another state, was prepared to go on record. Marsh's voice was careful and precise when he told me this. Then he told me the man's name. I recognized it from the journal. 7 years ago, Elias had sheltered a whistleblower who had left a large development company after witnessing what he described as deliberate decisions to falsify safety reports. The entry did not name the company. It did not name the man. It only said that he had arrived with nothing and left with a new start, and that Elias hoped he had found peace. The man Marsh named had worked for Crestwood. My grandfather had known this moment would come. He had sheltered the witness 7 years ago, not knowing exactly when the witness would be needed, only that someday the case would reach the point where a human voice telling the truth would make the difference between justice and nothing. He had given the man a new start. And now, the man was prepared to give something back. Everything Elias had done, from the day my parents died to the day he left me this land, had been pointing toward Thursday. The night before the hearing, I went to Bet's house. I had not been back since the morning of the confrontation. Scout had been sleeping at Bet's kitchen door every night for a week, trotting home in the mornings to check on me and then returning to her. He had made his position clear. She opened the door before I knocked. She had heard my footsteps on the path. I stood in the doorway. She stood inside. We looked at each other across the threshold. I had spent the week reading my grandfather's letters, all 17 of them, one for every birthday. I had read them in order, slowly, one per night, and the cumulative weight of them had done something to the structure of things inside me. Not fixed it, rearranged it. Turned certain locked things toward the light long enough for me to see them differently. He had forgiven Bet. Not loudly and not immediately, but over time, with the grace of someone who understood that guilt can be a kind of prison that punishes the person inside it long after punishment has ceased to serve any purpose. I was not my grandfather. I was not there yet, but I was at the door. "I need you to come with me tomorrow," I said. Bet's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and nodded. I stepped inside and she put her arms around me, and I stood very still and let her. She cried. I did not, but I held on. The morning of the hearing, I woke before the sun. I sat at the kitchen table with the metal box open in front of me. The documents, the letters, the evidence my parents had gathered and my grandfather had protected, and the community of people who had passed through this land had in some small way contributed to simply by surviving and going on. I thought about what my grandfather had written in the very last letter, the one dated 6 months before he died, the one he had written knowing he would not be there to hand it to me himself. "You will be afraid. That's all right. Do it afraid. The thing that matters is not whether you feel ready. The thing that matters is whether you show up. I have never doubted that you would show up. Not once. Not for a single day in 19 years. I closed the box. Then, finally, I picked up the other envelope. The one Mr. Patton had given me on the day I left St. Agnes. The one I had carried for weeks without opening. I had been waiting without knowing exactly what I was waiting for. Now I knew. I needed to understand everything before I could receive the rest. The letter was short, 4 sentences in the same careful, deliberate hand. Clara, if you are reading this, you found everything. You already know why I did what I did. The only thing left to say is this: I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. Come home. That was all. I folded it carefully and put it with the others. Scout was waiting by the door. I picked up the folder of documents. I picked up my grandfather's journal. I looked around the kitchen at the clock on the mantel and the work gloves on the counter and the second cup Bet had set out the morning I arrived before she knew I was coming. Then I walked out into the March morning and got in the truck. The town hall of Millhaven was standing room only. Marsh's article had gone live at 6 in the morning. By the time I arrived, 3 television crews were setting up cameras outside. People I recognized from the hardware store and the general store and the diner were filing through the doors with the quiet purposefulness of people who have decided that something matters enough to show up for. Calhoun Reed was standing by the entrance. He looked at me once, steady and direct, and gave a single nod. Lorraine Pruitt was inside, saving a seat in the front row. Beside her, Bet. And at the end of the row, Winona Redhawk, her carved walking stick resting against her knee, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. Garrett Hale was at the front table with his team of lawyers. His face was pale. The confident smile was completely gone. Beside him, the development company's presentation board stood propped against the wall, their glossy renderings of luxury cabins and manicured fairways looking slightly absurd in the fluorescent light of a small town hall. Commissioner Wakefield sat with the panel at the front of the room. He had not looked up since I came in. Sylvia Wakefield was in the 3rd row. She was very still. I walked to the front and sat down between Lorraine and Bet. Bet reached over and put her hand briefly over mine. The hearing was called to order. Crestwood's lawyers began their presentation. Nobody was listening. Phones were buzzing with news alerts. People were leaning to each other and whispering. The lawyers stumbled through their prepared remarks with the specific misery of people who know that the story has already moved past them. Then the chair asked if there were any public comments. I stood up, and before I could speak, from the 3rd row, Sylvia Wakefield rose to her feet. The room went completely silent. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes on the middle distance, and the expression of someone who has been rehearsing a particular moment for a very long time, and has finally decided that the cost of continuing to wait is higher than the cost of speaking. "Before this young woman says anything," Sylvia said, her voice clear and careful and very tired, "there are things this community deserves to hear from me first." Sylvia spoke for 11 minutes. I know because the clock on the town hall wall was directly in my eye line, and I watched it without meaning to, the way you watch something steady when everything else in the room is moving. She did not read from notes. She stood with her hands clasped and her eyes mostly forward, and she spoke in the measured, careful voice of someone who has decided that if they are going to do this, they are going to do it completely. She told the room about her husband's arrangement with Crestwood, about the payments, about the phone call he had made to Bet Holloway on the night Sarah and Michael Mercer drove into a ravine on a wet road. About 14 years of knowing and staying quiet because the knowing had made her complicit, and the complicity had made the silence feel like the only option that did not destroy everything. She did not cry. She did not ask for sympathy. She said what had happened, plainly and in order, and when she was finished, she sat back down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor. The room was completely silent for a long moment. Then I stood up. I did not look at Garrett Hale. I looked at the panel, at the people in the rows behind me, at Winona sitting at the end of the front row with her walking stick and her silver hair and the stillness of someone who has been patient for a very long time. "My name is Clara Mercer," I said. "I am the granddaughter of Elias Mercer, who owned the land Crestwood wants to develop. And I am the daughter of Sarah and Michael Mercer, who were murdered 14 years ago for trying to expose the truth about this company." I set the folder on the table in front of the panel. Then I sat down and let Marcia's article and my parents' documents and 17 years of my grandfather's careful, quiet work do what they had been built to do. Winona walked to the podium last. She read the names slowly. The names of the ancestors who rested in the northern woods. Names that had been passed down through generations in the memories of people who had refused to let them become folklore. She read each one with the full weight of its history, and the room listened the way rooms listen when they understand they are in the presence of something that will not come again. When she finished, someone in the back began to clap. Then Lorraine, then Calhoun, then the room. The panel chair called for order twice before giving up. Garrett Hale was escorted out in handcuffs 20 minutes later by two men in federal windbreakers who had been sitting quietly in the back row since before the hearing began. He walked past me on his way to the door. He looked at me once. There was no smile left. Only the cold thing that had always been underneath it, and underneath that, something smaller and less certain than I had expected. I did not say anything. I just watched him go. The permits were denied. The development project was dead. The weeks that followed were a blur of phone calls and legal proceedings and the exhaustion of doing something that matters. Crestwood's stock collapsed. Their CEO resigned. Multiple executives were indicted. The company's assets were frozen. The environmental investigation Marsh had triggered expanded to include all three dumping sites, and the communities whose water had been poisoned for years finally had someone listening to them. Commissioner Wakefield resigned from his position and was later charged as part of the federal investigation. He did not fight it. The northern section of the land was designated a protected cultural heritage site. Winona and the Tribal Council worked with state and federal agencies through the spring and into the summer, and by fall the first formal documentation of the sacred sites was complete. A record that would survive in perpetuity in a way that oral history alone could not guarantee. A small memorial was placed in a clearing in the meadow where the wildflowers grew thickest. A stone marker with two names, Sarah and Michael Mercer. Below the names, a single line that Winona had suggested, and I had not been able to improve on. They told the truth. They are not forgotten. I went there on a Tuesday morning in late April when the meadow was just beginning to come back to life. The grass was the pale green of early spring, and the first wildflowers were opening, purple and yellow in the long morning light. I stood there for a long time without saying anything. Scout lay down in the grass beside the stone and put his chin on his paws. I thought about what it means to finish someone else's work, whether it counts as yours or whether it remains theirs, whether you are the author of it or just the last person to carry it. I did not come to a conclusion. I decided that was all right. It was enough that it was done. Sylvia Wakefield came to the farm on a Wednesday morning in May. She did not call ahead. She parked on the gravel and walked to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps without coming up. She was carrying a manila folder, and she looked like someone who has slept better recently, but is still carrying the memory of all the nights before that. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything," she said. "I'm not here to ask." She held out the folder. Inside were documents she had gathered herself over the previous weeks, using the connections she still had with the county planning office and the council network before her husband's resignation had ended most of those relationships. Property boundary clarifications, tax assessment corrections, a letter from the state recommending dismissal of the environmental complaint, which had been traced back to a Crestwood-affiliated filing service. She had done the paperwork that needed doing, quietly, without telling anyone, without expecting credit. I looked at the documents and then at her. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once, turned to go. "Sylvia." She stopped. "You did the right thing, in the hearing." She did not turn around immediately. She stood with her back to me for a moment. "It cost you something. I know that." She turned then. Her face was composed, but something in her eyes was different from the practiced warmth I had first encountered in the hardware store. Something real had replaced it, quieter and less certain, and considerably more honest. "It should have cost me something 14 years ago," she said. She walked back to her car. I watched her go and thought about the difference between punishment and change, about how one of them ends and the other one keeps going, about how my grandfather had understood that distinction in a way that had taken me much longer to learn. In June, Calhoun came by on a Saturday morning with his truck loaded with lumber. He pulled up and got out and looked at the half-collapsed side of the barn and then looked at me. "Ready?" he said. I had not asked him to come. He had simply decided the time was right and appeared. We worked through the morning in the comfortable silence I had come to associate with him, the silence of two people who have learned that they do not need to fill the space between them. Around noon, I brought coffee out and we sat on the tailgate of his truck and looked at what we had built so far. "Elias told me once that a good barn takes 3 summers, Calhoun said. He looked at the structure, its fresh lumber bright against the weathered older sections. "First summer, you frame it. Second summer, you figure out what you got wrong. Third summer, you fix it, and then it's done right." He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the mountains, clear and snow-capped in the June light. "I think about that sometimes," he said. "About things that take 3 summers." He paused. "About whether the same is true of other things." I looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something to the meadow, turning the new grass a gold that made everything look slightly unreal. "I think it probably is," I said. He looked at me then, just for a moment. Something passed between us that was neither of us quite ready to name, but both of us willing to let exist. Then he finished his coffee and went back to work. By August, the barn was framed. By September, the roof was on. By the first frost of October, the structure was sound, and the hidden spaces beneath the floor had been rebuilt, better and deeper than before, with concealed ventilation and a secondary exit that came up in the root cellar. The old phone, the one from the metal box, the one that had sat in a kitchen drawer for months, I plugged it in on a Tuesday evening in November and set it on the counter. It rang on a Thursday, a woman's voice, quiet and frightened, speaking carefully as if she had rehearsed the words until they were smooth. "Someone gave me this number," she said. "They said if I needed help, if I needed to disappear. They said there was a place." I looked out the kitchen window at the barn, solid and dark against the November sky. Scout lifted his head from beside the stove. "Tell me where you are," I said. "Drive toward Millhaven. When you get close, call this number again and I'll give you the last mile." I paused. "It's a dirt road. Your car will be fine. When you get here, the porch light will be on." She breathed out. The sound of it, someone releasing something they had been holding for too long, was a sound I recognized. "Thank you," she said. Drive safe, I said. You're almost there. On the first Sunday in December, I made the stew. Betta's recipe, though she had given it to me as my mother's recipe, and perhaps it had been before that too, handed down through some chain of women in kitchens on cold mornings until it arrived in my hands. The table was full. Lorraine, who had driven 3 hours in the first snow of the season and refused all offers to stay at a motel. Calhoun, who arrived early and helped set up chairs without being asked. Winona's daughter and granddaughter, who carried in a dish that smelled of cedar and sage and set it at the center of the table. The aldermans from the general store. Henderson, the fire chief. 3 families from the surrounding farms whose names I was still learning. And Bet, who had been in the kitchen since morning, moving around the space with the ease of someone who has decided to belong somewhere and then simply begun. At one point, she reached past me for the wooden spoon, and I handed it to her, and she looked at me with something warm and specific in her eyes. "You need more salt," she said. "You always say that." "You always need more salt." Scout moved between the table and the kitchen, accepting small pieces of things from everyone with the dignified gratitude of a dog who knows he is loved. After dinner, after the dishes, after most people had gone, I found Bet standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dark yard. The last snow of evening was just beginning to fall. "Bet," I said. She turned. I did not plan what I said next. It just came, the way things come when you have finally stopped bracing against them. "Thank you," I said, "for keeping this place, for waiting." I stopped, started again, "for being here when I got here." She looked at me for a long moment. "Grandma Bet," I said quietly, testing it, seeing how it fit. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. She reached out and put her hand against my face, very briefly, the way you touch something you were afraid you would never get to touch. Then she turned back to the window, and we stood there together for a while, watching the snow come down. After everyone had gone, I sat on the porch in my grandfather's chair with a blanket and a cup of coffee and looked out at the land. The snow was falling soft and straight in the still air, settling on the meadow, on the barn roof, on the stone marker in the clearing where the wild flowers had been. The barn was a dark shape at the edge of the yard, and beyond it, somewhere in the black, the mountains were waiting for morning the way they always did. Scout climbed the porch steps and rested his chin on my knee. I thought about 19 years of believing that belonging was something that happened to other people. That home was a place you were assigned to or removed from depending on circumstances beyond your control. That love was something you had to be careful about receiving because it could be taken back. I put my hand on Scout's head. The porch light was on. The woman who had called on Thursday was asleep in the upstairs bedroom, her daughter in the small room next to her, both of them safe in a house that had been built for exactly this purpose, by a man who understood that a life becomes meaningful in direct proportion to what you are willing to risk it for. I sat there for a long time. The snow kept coming down. Somewhere out in the meadow, under the white and the cold and the long dark of a Montana winter, the land was resting. The wild flowers were waiting. The names on the stone were held in the silence the way names always are, patient and permanent, asking nothing except to be remembered. I remembered them, all of them. I had spent 19 years believing no one wanted me. It turned out I was the most loved person in the room. I just couldn't see the walls they had built around me until I was standing safely inside them. I picked up my coffee cup. I looked at the barn, at the light in the upstairs window, at the snow coming down on 600 acres of land that was mine, that had always been mine, that had been waiting for me to be ready to receive it. "I'm home, Grandpa," I said quietly. The snow came down, Scout sighed against my knee, and the world, for the first time in as long as I could remember, felt exactly the right size.